Welcome to the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show from Awful Announcing, where I am wondering how Tom Brady turned "let's go" into a catchphrase. The most normal, everybody says it thing in the entire world. Starting off Fox's NFL playoff coverage with that still confounds me. I'm Brendon Kleen, a staff writer at Awful Announcing. That's Ben Axelrod, a senior editor at Awful Announcing. We are back for you as the football craziness continues. We have an ESPN college football playoff coverage reality check, an NFL playoff broadcast team check-in with Andrew Bucholtz of Awful Announcing, and the return of Stockwatch on the NFL coaching carousel. Ben, we're also, I'm introducing like two new recurring bits at you that I'm just going to throw at you along the way here, but can we steal "let's go" from Brady? Can we just make that ours? I think he has it copyrighted, but I still don't get exactly how.
Well, his is "let's fucking go," right? When you say "let's go,"
well, the podcast is "let's go." On Fox, he has to water it down.
Yeah.
I don't know.
See, when you say "let's go," I think of Peter Schrager. Like, that's to me a Peter Schragerism is "let's go."
That was pretty good.
Thanks.
That was pretty good.
I'm working on it.
Well, either way, I think you got to be a little bit more creative if you're gonna make it your thing. It has to be a phrase that not every like dad at a little league game or person playing a video game on their couch says when something good happens. But we're in the middle of, well, toward the end, but right before the championship game of the college football playoff. We've gotten through most of this first ever experiment of the 12-team tournament, and you are proudly supporting your Ohio State Buckeyes here, who survived a regular season that had some tumult to appear where we always thought they might in that championship game. And so you've had, I think, an up-close seat for a lot of this, Ben. My beloved Arizona State Sun Devils were in the first round and gave me a pretty fun game. But what has been your top-line takeaway from on the broadcast and coverage side of this, ESPN owning all of it and controlling all of the narratives and all of the way we receive this whole thing? How have you digested that side of it from afar as a fan?
Yeah, I think what stands out especially is that opening weekend. One, because it was just so new. I mean, it wasn't just the start of a 12-team college football playoff. It was the first time we've ever had on-site campus games. And I think back to that first college game day on that Friday night with Notre Dame and Indiana and Shane Gillis as the guest picker. And before the game even started, like you felt this electricity just even watching it on television. It was like a winter night. It was right around the middle of the holidays. It was just a really cool experience. And then heading into the rest of the weekend, it was a really bad experience. And not because the games were predominantly blowouts, but I think because ESPN and their coverage, just for whatever reason, was not ready for this in the type of how they wanted to present this and how they wanted to be their voice to be heard. And I thought our Matt Yoder, wrote it best. He wrote on that following Monday, ESPN's college football coverage makes for a miserable, negative experience. And that's where you had, a lot of the armchair quarterbacking about which teams should have been in. As soon as Indiana lost to Notre Dame, you had all this armchair quarterbacking about which teams should have been in. It turned into, the perception of SEC bias. You had Kirk Herbstreit talking about Ohio State in the lunatic fringe of the fan base randomly in the middle of ESPN's broadcast of Ohio State.
Do you identify as a member, Ben? Are you part of it?
I think I meet Kirk Herbstreit's definition because his definition was anybody who was like upset they lost to Michigan. At least that's how it came off during the broadcast. Yeah. And then he came back, appeared on Pat McAfee on Monday. That's when he called out First Take too, and in their coverage of Ryan Day during that broadcast. But then he went on McAfee and kind of clarified he wasn't talking about fans who were upset about the loss to Michigan. He was talking about fans who post Ryan Day's address online and send him death threats, which, to be clear, is not me. I am not like that far into the lunatic fringe. I am just like lunatic fringe adjacent, I guess. But I have been hard on Ryan Day, and it seemed like that was what qualified for Kirk Herbstreit as being a lunatic. And so I thought overall that first weekend stood out because ESPN, this was a moment that should have been celebrated. And after that first game day, like ESPN did not live up to its end of the bargain there.
So we are rewinding a little bit, right? Like this has happened over the course of more than a month, and so we're piecing it together. I will say that I think to establish some positives before we get into some negatives, right? Like I think the overall experience has gotten more positive. The games have been better. I think it helped that, once we didn't have to talk about the teams that we didn't think maybe should be there, that we just got to talk about the best teams. And I think that just helps everything move along. And I think the blowout of more game day is an awesome part of all of this, right? Like we just get that show, which I think everybody likes and which is something that ESPN has absolutely nailed over the years, but especially recently bolstering it with Pat and with Nick Saban. And, I think, being a little more creative with the guest pickers, I think in recent years as well, that all has been very good stuff and has led to more of the viral moments and obviously the more celebratory and kind of positive thing that we were hoping for off the top. So like that I think is without a doubt true. And I want to get to Kirk and I want to get to some criticisms that even Pat has had that I think are a little more true than maybe they even got noticed as in the moment. But just in terms of the game broadcast experience, because this is something you and I were kind of messaging about along the way here. And I want to say that that they need to invest a little bit more, maybe the same way that they have in game day, in really going over the top with the people calling the games. But as much as I can throw that take out there and I can nitpick about, one play-by-play guy, one game analyst or whatever, I don't really hate any of them. And it kind of was making me think of the Athletic, the college football survey that we brought Chris Vanini on to talk about, where I think we had a smaller discussion there of like what really mints a great college football, especially a color guy, right? Like what even do we want there? Because it really seems like it's the relationship you build over time. So I can't knock ESPN for putting a Greg McElroy in or somebody else while also admitting that the best ones tend to be guys we kind of fall in love with over time. Kirk Herbstreit's not some kind of famous dude when he first comes out. The CBS group, that's something that's become tradition. That's not exactly just because it's a flashy name necessarily. So where do you stand on who is delivering the games to us? And if there's anything that needs to happen there, or if maybe 5 years from now, we just kind of get used to quarterfinals, it's this guy, semifinals, it's that, by the end, it's Herbstreit and it's Fowler. And we just we know what to expect.
Yeah, I've had kind of a unique experience with this because as somebody who's primarily followed this through an Ohio State lens, Kirk Herbstreit has called all of Ohio State's games. And so that's been kind of weird that just like you have the same broadcast team for 4 consecutive games and it's the top broadcast team in all of college football. But it is like, it's just weird. It's like Kirk and Chris Fowler again, like, this is like they're becoming like the Ohio State radio booth. Like it's like they just call the Ohio State game every week. But I think, and this is something you and I talked about offline, is what's unique about all of this is that ESPN owns the rights to all these games. It's not like the NFL playoffs where Fox gets a piece, NBC gets a piece, Amazon gets a piece. All the networks get a piece. Like this is an ESPN production top to bottom, even the games they're leasing out to WBD, Warner Brothers Discovery. And so I also think there's a part of it where, no disrespect to anybody else, but there is a big drop off, at least perception wise, from ESPN's top booth to its second booth and then so on. And so I think that when you factor all of that in, it just creates a unique experience where unless you have that Kirk Chris Fowler booth, like all the other games feel a little bit secondary. And so I do think it's something where I don't know if it hurts ESPN, but I think it hurts the production. I think it hurts the presentation to not have more top booths. I mean, I'm not the biggest Gus Johnson, Joel Klatt fan, Fox's top booth, but I think like they should be calling playoff games. Like I don't know how you rectify that, but I do think it's something that stands in contrast to the NFL and the NBA and the way they present their playoffs and the way college football is presenting its playoff.
Yeah, it's in the NFL and NBA, right? Like if you're a fan of a team, the Ohio State point is a good one where I mean, the NBA passes individual series off game to game, which is sort of crazy when you just think about it in a vacuum. If you were to design it up, that's probably not what you would want. You'd like that Kevin Harlan and Reggie Miller just call all of Nick's Pacers, but they don't. Right. And then in NFL, obviously, it's really just based on when the game is happening, maybe where the game is happening, and obviously who has the Super Bowl, and then the kind of dominoes backward from there. So it is a little bit unique here, not only to have the same network own it all, and they own it, by the way, we should say, through 2031. So this is not changing anytime soon. But not just that, but also that they get to basically tear down their teams top to bottom all over again every week because they have that level of control and because the games are spaced so far out and everything else. So I don't know, like agreed that it would be nice if Joel Klatt and Gus Johnson or the CBS guys or, Noah Eagle or something could be involved here, but they're not. So in the meantime, like, do we think, should ESPN be saying, okay, great, thank you, Dusty Dvorak, and thank you, Greg McElroy, thank you, Jesse Palmer, for your services. But once we get to a certain point with this whole thing, Booger McFarland, Louis Riddick, Dan Orlovsky, those guys are going to be flown in here to make this thing feel a little bit more big time, to deliver a product and show our fans that we're doing that. Or again, I come back to do those relationships and kind of the college guys are the college guys. This, build the tradition, build the relationship, let the talent develop, and that's just going to make for the better product. What would you do?
I think I'd stick with the college talent. I think that's of the two options there. That's what I would prefer as a college football fan. I think college football is just such a unique animal and such a unique sport that I think fans in general would not like guys who are primarily viewed as NFL guys coming in, and some of them just have, and I'm not saying Orlovsky or Riddick do this, but some of them just have trouble viewing football through anything but an NFL lens. And I could see an issue where, they're talking about them too much as prospects or things like that and how they translate to the NFL. I think fans they like the idea of like Greg McElroy being a former Alabama quarterback and having a relationship with him through that. And so I like that. But I don't know. I think ESPN kind of has to level up. Like they kind of just need to, do what, and it's not even on the talent. I think it's like they present their product in such a way where Kirk and Chris Fowler are the top booth and everything else is secondary. And I think you kind of need to level up the other booths and give them an opportunity to feel, on that level.
So that brings us to, I think, the Pat McAfee criticisms, which are a little bit more broad. And he had a couple of different times throughout this, I almost said throughout this whole thing, and that would literally be borrowing a Pat McAfee-ism to describe Pat McAfee, because I definitely have picked up that vernacular from him, but I watch his show too much. He has said both on the social media side, he knocked them for the reveal, I think the final playoff seeding, not having that information readily available on I think he mostly was hitting them on the Twitter side, and there's a whole, Disney not loving Twitter thing that you can go down. But I think that is valid, whether you're talking about social media or just the presence of the sport at the top levels of ESPN, and that will get us to the Kirk side of things back here to close it. And he made fun of the jingle. And like in typical Pat McAfee fashion, like that was very silly, and he's teasing AJ Hawk by playing it over and over. And, then obviously it kind of circles back and it stops being a joke at some point and they legit are just singing it because it is kind of catchy in its own way. But it's this animated thing it didn't feel like the level of hype and football that you probably would expect, if you were to compare it to like whatever we're going to see to kick off the Super Bowl in a month on Fox, right? So I think it does kind of speak to Pat correctly identifying that ESPN has always been criticized for not like covering college football the same way that it covers other sports, and maybe that being harder to get away with in a world where the sport is so big now and so blown out and so popular that you can't treat it like a little brother anymore, while also being the network that has sole autonomy over how the whole thing goes. That doesn't work anymore.
No, I don't think so. And that's I think I didn't like the jingle. I thought the jingle was dumb. I thought that I was surprised they went with it. Like it just felt like a very like almost like 90s type of thing. But to your larger point, like, yeah, but that's what Pat McAfee's there to do, right? Like he's a disruptor and
but he can't do it all himself.
Right. No, I agree with that. But I don't know. I think that altogether, I think this has largely been a positive experience. Like, I think this has been a awesome playoff. I think it's been a really fun experience. So going back to that game day, just to end this on a positive note, like I thought that was the best episode of Game Day I've ever seen. The one before Notre Dame, Indiana, like having Shane Gillis on there teasing Nick Saban and stuff like that, to me is the stuff that ESPN gets right when it comes to the college football playoff. I think that's why it was so jarring to just see that weekend take such a sharp turn into negativity and bitching and moaning about who should have made it and who did make it and blowouts and things of that nature. I mean, college football is full of blowouts. We have blowouts every weekend. There are weekends where there's not a single good game. And so I thought that we kind of lost the plot on all of that. But yeah, to me, it's just like, I'd like to see them take whatever the magic ingredients were for that episode of Game Day leading into Notre Dame, Indiana, and lean into that, because I thought that was ESPN and its college football coverage at its best.
I will bring it back to the positive at the very, very end with my hot mic. But before we jump to Andrew Bucholtz and go through some NFL booths and discuss whether they're over, under, or properly rated. And I do appreciate you shining some positivity, because it has been fun, and I have really gotten into it, even though I think I told you earlier on in this first few months of our show together that I really only get locked into college football if there's an awesome quarterback that I can kind of glue onto. I'm sure it helped that ASU was good this year, but I've been in, and there's not a great quarterback to glom onto this year, but it's still been a lot of fun to watch. So absolutely plenty to be positive about. But I mentioned that I would throw a new bit at you, and I have it here for you, and we'll wrap here. Wagyu versus cheesesteak. This is our beef scale. All right. We got grade A, or I'm sure I'm butchering that. Grade A, grade 1, whatever the best kind of primo steak can possibly be in Tokyo or wherever you're going to find it, versus the crap that they're going to throw on a stale loaf of bread with some cheese whiz outside of the link. That is what we are throwing here. Kirk, I don't even know who the verses should be here, Ben, because we mentioned the Lunatic Fringe, we mentioned First Take, we mentioned all of Twitter, which he allegedly has deleted but somehow posts on here still. Oh my God. Kirk versus the world. How good of a beef is this? How real of a beef is this whole thing?
Well, cheesesteak is like my favorite food. That's my favorite sandwich. So I'm trying to recalibrate my scale here. But
is there a worse beef we could use as the bottom?
No, it's fine. I think it works for the bit. But I mean, this is a real beef. Like Kirk Herbstreit is going through it. He's always been
Kirk versus himself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that might be what this is. I mean, he might be on the later side for a midlife crisis, but all of this has just been so bizarre, from feuding with Ohio State fans, which is something he's done throughout his career. I mean, he played at Ohio State. For people who don't know, he came up in the Columbus market, but he's always just had this like hard on for Ohio State fans and how passionate they are, and even going out of his way to say that like they're the reason he moved to Nashville all those years ago. It's been a bizarre thing, but to see it now on a national scale and him claiming that he doesn't actually run his Twitter account, that it's his son, yet all the posts are just like posts of his dog, except for when he's fighting with fans. It's bizarre. He's having a moment, and it's not a good moment. I can't explain it. But he's leaning into like his worst inhibitions when it comes to like how he presents himself as a media figure. And so I don't know, like, if he needs to recalibrate, if he's overexposed, because he is like on TV a lot between.
I will tell you, he travels more than I would like to. So I could see that taking a toll.
I mean, even like during the day, like sometimes he'll do game day at one site and then be on another college campus to call a game that same night. So, man, I just like, he needs to take some time away from football this offseason and just kind of recalibrate, because I think he's really talented in the booth. I mean, I actually thought he did a nice job during Steelers Ravens on Amazon and kind of calling the Steelers out for not playing with enough pride or passion or what have you. But, man, like it's just been a rough, like that Monday after the first round, and just like after he called out First Take and then Shannon Sharp went at him, it's like, man, like this feels like a fork in the road for Kirk Herbstreit, and it's going to be interesting to see where he goes from here.
And to his credit, he did kind of tone it down after that, right? He didn't keep up some kind of big intra ESPN war and whatever. And like, you know, to be fair, I think in that particular instance, I would be closer to being on Herbstreit's side than First Take, because frankly, any college football discussion on that particular show is not good. So, you know, him going after them for being so hot and cold and extreme with their takes on the sport is totally fair. But I will give this much closer to cheesesteak because he backed down. If he had still been feuding with Shannon and we were still talking about this, I think I would, give it closer to that top cut of meat. But right now, you know, he just went back to doing his work, which I think we appreciate, but it makes for worse beef. All right, on to NFL booths. We're going to go through 3 that kind of range the whole spectrum from our awful announcing NFL announcer rankings with Andrew Bucholtz, who put that whole thing together for us. And then we'll each shout out a booth that deserves a little more love from the bottom, from the lower tiers of Fox, CBS, and beyond, that we think are a little better than they got credit for. So we'll do that next. All right, Andrew Bucholtz is here from Awful Announcing. He got almost 2,500 people who watch the NFL to tell us what they like and dislike about dozens of the best, well, the top, the only booths across the whole league, from Netflix to Fox and everywhere else. So we're going to go through a few that surprised us, a few that maybe got a lot of attention throughout the season, and whether they're over, under, or properly rated. So let's start at CBS with Ian Eagle and Charles Davis. They got a playoff game during Wild Card Weekend, and I suggested that we talk about this one for one very specific reason, guys, which, Andrew, I'll throw it to you first. I think that this is kind of like the Mendoza line booth for what qualifies as being like, I'm good if they call a playoff game, but I'm not going to be jumping up and down when I hear them coming through my speakers, and I'm probably not going to ever turn it off. It's just kind of, I'm in good hands, and that's the most I can say. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think our readers who voted in this would certainly agree with you. I mean, what stood out to me about the results for Eagle and Davis were, I gave them the title of readers' least hated 2024 booth, because they got the lowest amount of Fs. And that's despite getting a lot more votes than a lot of the one-game booths or the altcast booths. They also got the highest percentage of passing grades in this poll. So even if there were a significant amount of people who really loved them, who gave them A's, but even those who don't like them quite that much would often give them a B or a C rather than a D or an F.
I should say they were 5th on our total rankings here. Ben, what do you think of this duo?
Yeah, I think that you kind of nailed it. They're kind of the Mendoza line of what a high level NFL booth is. Looking back at my Tom Brady criticism or analysis, actually my praise of him, and my whole thing was like, if Tom Brady can just be like as good as Charles Davis, which probably wasn't fair to Charles Davis, because Charles Davis is a really good analyst. He just doesn't have the same star power as some of the other top analysts. So that's where this booth, I guess you could say, is lacking. But I don't know how much that actually matters to the typical viewer.
Yeah, to me, first of all, Charles Davis, when I hear him, I just think of Madden and I get mad. That's kind of like the emotional response is Charles Davis, the thing, because video games, it's just those same recognizable one-liners, and you know what's coming when you throw an interception or you fumble it, and he's going to say the damn thing, and then you're going to be even more angry with yourself. That's kind of like the recipe with him, and so that's part of it that I think maybe I'm responding to. But I'm going to say this on him before we jump to a Fox booth next year, because I'm going to be speaking a little bit out of both sides of my mouth, because I kind of want Davis to try a little bit more of what Brady does, which is I kind of want to hear, or like what Troy Aikman does, as another example, where he's not afraid to weigh in on the bigger picture stuff going on in the league. Davis almost is like a radio color commentator where he's just delivering the beat by beat, and I think that's where it comes up a little short. I would think that this is probably heavily skewed toward people liking Iron Eagle quite a lot, and that's where maybe them getting all the way up to 5th is coming from. But like I said, certainly good hands. Ben already mentioned the next booth we're going to, which is Brady and Kevin Burkhardt. Andrew, what was the general vibe from our respondents and readers at Awful Announcing about the most talked about NFL booth of the year?
Yeah, so this booth finished 14th of the 25 we looked at. That's obviously Brady wasn't ranked last year with him being new to this. But it's a huge dive for Burkhardt, who had done very well with Greg Olsen, and Greg Olsen obviously wound up in our top ranked booth here with Joe Davis. So I think an interesting thing with the Brady and Burkhardt evaluation is how much of it is about the actual commentary of Brady and how much of it is people mad that Greg Olsen got bumped out of this booth. And I think the voting that had Olsen and Davis at the very top is an example that there were a fair bit of people thinking that way. And the comments for both of those booths also really showed that. I think another interesting thing with in the comments, there were a lot of people who talked about that maybe there's too much hate for Brady, that they found him better as an announcer than the general discourse on sites like ours might indicate. And I think a big part of that is really the spotlight. It's him going from not calling games at all, not really having any media experience at all, apart from his podcast, to being thrust onto the number one team. I think if this was, say, the 3rd or 4th Fox team, we'd have a lot less discussion about them every week, and I think they'd be seen a lot more favorably. But with that bright spotlight comes a lot of criticism.
Ben, that's exactly what we talked about all year with Brady, is like Olsen got to call non-NFL games. He got to call random bye-week games when he was still a tight end. And we didn't have to think about him until all of a sudden he was great at it, and we all loved it. Now Brady, they're telling us this is a big deal by how much they're paying him, and the fact that they demoted our favorite guy, it invited the scrutiny and the negativity, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, Greg Olsen was calling XFL games, so he really climbed his way from the bottom rung of Fox's broadcasting barrel to all the way to the top. And I think you and I, Brendon, I don't know where you stand on this, Andrew, is we're in agreement that this is probably one and done for Tom Brady. And I think whenever it ends, when we look back on Tom Brady as a broadcaster, I think a part of it is going to be fans really liked Greg Olsen, and they were upset that Greg Olsen got demoted from the top booth. And it was kind of a perfect storm. And I agree. I think Tom Brady is perfectly passable. I think if you were to slot him in to a 3rd or 4th booth, we wouldn't have a single conversation, but that's not the cards that's never been in the cards for Tom Brady. He was going to be the top booth or not. And so I just think, as we approach this Super Bowl that Tom Brady's going to call, I think the legacy of this whole thing is kind of coming into focus here.
I think
you said this whole thing. It wasn't just me, Ben. We both did it. Andrew, go
The
ahead.
one note I'd maybe just add there is that there is an interesting precedent for this, and even in our announcer ratings with Jason Witten a few years ago on going from never having called anything to being on Monday Night Football every week. And if you look at the announcer rankings for Witten with Joe Tess and Booger that first year, they were way harsher and way more critical than anything for Burkhardt and Brady here. Burkhardt and Brady wound up in about the middle of the pack, whereas the Witten booth was way down at the bottom, which is obviously terrible for a prime time one booth thing.
Yeah.
So I think even if this does wind up being one and done, it may be a disastrous failure in terms of the hype, the money invested, and so on. It's far from the most disliked announcing we've ever seen.
I do think it has a lot to do with who you're replacing, who's being demoted, or who's going away in the place of you. Where I think people did like that Tirico and Gruden booth, right? And so then the fact that had gone away, I think it was also the rub of the other guys, and Witten just sort of got the bulk of it. But the Boogermobile was obviously a disaster there, and even the play-by-play, and ESPN was just sort of in a dark zone. They didn't know where they were going. But then I think on the Fox side of it, it's funny because, like, obviously Olsen got the top spot in our rankings. A lot of people like him. It does kind of surprise me that the average fan loves him so much because he is pretty nerdy, I think, compared to some. But he's also the most demotable guy. You're not going to get rid of Chris Collinsworth. Tony Romo makes too much money. Troy Aikman, I think some people could even argue, is better than Greg Olsen and was very close to the top of our rankings as well, and everything else. So it's hard to really poke holes in the fact that Brady went and took his spot because he's the most green guy. He just also happens to be one of the most beloved ones. Real quick, Ben, what do you think of Burkhardt?
He's fine. He's passable. He doesn't, I'm a big Joe Buck fan. I feel like Joe Buck adds to broadcasts in a way that most play-by-play guys don't. Burkhardt to me is like, he's there. I think he's kind of dependent on who he's in the booth, which I think is reflected in the difference between his ratings with Witten or with Olsen, I'm sorry, and his ratings with Brady.
I kind of agree with you. I think that, and the reason I wanted to ask is, like, I think there's been so much talk with this booth that, oh, thank God he landed with Burkhardt. And it's like, yeah, but not as if it's some sort of saving grace. And I think he does set Brady up. They clearly have a good relationship in chemistry where he cues Brady up. He also knows when Brady is stumbling and not knowing what to say next, and he'll pick it back up from there. And that all helps, but I don't think Burkhardt is the very, very top either, and I think that our respondents kind of spoke to that. We didn't do over, under, or properly rated with Davis and Eagle, so let's go back there, and then we'll do this one, or with, Davis and Eagle. I think overrated. I think fifth is too high for a booth that's the second booth at a network. I mean, even if you just say Brady and Burkhardt maybe are a little lower, you still got, 7, 8 other teams to pick from there. I don't think that the second booth at CBS, with what I said about Davis in particular, quite gets me there. So I'm going to go fifth is overrated for that one. What do you got, Ben?
I'd say properly rated. I think when you factor in that the Brady booth is not going to be in the top 5, that does leave, some room to climb up. And so if we agree like they're worthy of a playoff game, then yeah, 5 is probably about right.
Andrew?
I think they're actually underrated. They came in second overall in our rankings last year.
Wow,
and
I didn't realize that. Okay.
And I think it shouldn't just be about who gets the top assignment from a network. I think that's how the network people think, but I don't think that is necessarily indicative of what actually makes a good booth. I think a lot of how you rank these guys is going to depend on your thoughts on that A booth of Nance and Romo. And I personally would rather listen to Eagle and Davis than Nance and Romo. And our readers overall would as well. Nance and Romo finished 6th, 1 spot behind them. And interestingly enough, the third booth of Kevin Harlan and Trent Green finished 1 spot ahead at 4th. So, I mean, I think it was relatively fair for all those to be pretty close to each other. I think those are all very good booths and which one you like comes down a lot to personal preference on what you want in a broadcast. But I do think 5 is maybe a little low for these guys, especially considering the response they got last year.
I like it. I think people, it's too en vogue to hate Tony Romo. We're not getting to that booth, but people need to shut up about him. Okay, over underrated Brady Burkhardt at 14th, Ben.
I'd say overrated. I don't think it's been a great experience.
I agree. I think 14th is actually too high, even with that said. I think we just need to, the kid gloves are beyond done with Brady. He's not good enough to be in the spot that he's in, and he's not as good as a lot of these people. And honestly, some of the people behind him are altcast guys who probably just suffered because they didn't actually get much shine, but maybe would even be above Brady if they actually were working consistently. But Andrew, what do you think on Brady and Burkhardt?
Yeah, I also think a bit overrated. I think the numerical score for them is probably about fair. They got a 2.17, so that's just C minus ish essentially, and I think that's fair. But I think there are booths behind them that have been working together longer, which I think is a big thing. And you get and they have a lot more chemistry, and I think give you a better in-game experience watching them. And I think the reason why Brady and Burkhardt wound up here is part of what you were talking about they're that number one booth. They get that level of focus. And I think we're at a point where we're seeing a backlash to the backlash of Brady isn't actually that bad. Everyone hates on him too much. And so I think that led them to maybe be a little higher in the rankings than they deserve, but maybe not in the numerical grade.
If it was Kevin Burkhardt and John Smith, I think they would have finished 20th. Eisen and Kurt Warner is our last one. NFL Network, they called my team's Week 18 game on a Saturday. They call the early morning games overseas a lot of the time. And I think, they're in the studio together on Sunday mornings as well. I think Warner has sort of grown as a guy that breaks through as an analyst over time. But I think the play-by-play, Ben, is the part where this one kind of goes south for a lot of people. They were 15th. We'll just speed through this one. Over, under, or properly rated for Eisen and Warner on NFL Network.
I thought overrated. I'm not a Rich Eisen guy. I think you're either a Rich Eisen guy or you're not a Rich Eisen guy. I'm not. I don't know if it's a Ohio State, Michigan thing. He's just never been my cup of tea. And so I think he's kind of a weird fit as a play-by-play guy because he is such a big personality, although I'm kind of contradicting myself there by saying I'm also a big Joe Buck fan. But I don't know.
Joe Buck doesn't have a daily radio show. So.
Exactly. And they also call they usually call the overseas games, right? The Eisen Warner booth. And so they get a lot of bad games too. So maybe that holds them down, but this is probably my least favorite booth, to be honest.
What do you think, Andrew?
See, I think they're a little underrated, actually. And I think all of those points were completely fair when they started. I think this booth was really bad when they first started calling games. Eisen felt very, very out of place there. But I think NFL Network, in my mind, has been smart to stick with these guys as their lead team. They still don't get a lot of reps relative to most teams. They're calling a couple games a year usually. But I think they've really grown together. And I think this is a pretty good product now. They finished right below Brady and Burkhardt in the rankings, and I'd take them over that duel.
All right, I like it. We're gonna go. I'll give them properly rated. I think that. I just don't notice. It takes a really terrible play-by-play person for it to really detract from me. I don't think Eisen is quite so bad. Maybe Ben has the bias against Eisen because of the, Big Ten rivalry there. I have some allegiance toward Kurt Warner because he's the only thing that's ever been good to happen to the team that I'm wearing on my head. So I have to give him his credit where it's due. And I do think he's pretty good at breaking stuff down in real time, even when they are calling those bad games. But let's go through each one of us 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds on a booth we think. I think all of these are our underrated booths that we would like to highlight here. So I'll start off. I think Adam Amin and Mark Sanchez. I know that Sanchez had some flubs that got a lot of attention, including ones we covered. I think he said the wrong thing a few times, and just our respondents said he felt a little loose, a little out of sorts. But hey, that's what happens when you have not done this very much. And I think that Adam Amin is one of the best guys, could easily be doing a higher level booth if the opportunity arose, and would be perfectly in place there. And I think Sanchez, maybe I'm biased because I have seen him in more of a studio environment. He does the herd a lot. He has some good things that break through there. I've suggested him as somebody Fox could promote for its college side to give him some higher up reps. I just think he really knows his stuff and seems pretty ready to work hard at this whole thing. So I will, I'll give it to him, and I'll say that they're my underrated, need some shine booth. Who do you got, Ben?
My underrated one came in at 19. It is the Tom McCarthy, Jay Feely, Ross Tucker booth. And this is primarily a nod to Ross Tucker, who I think is a rising star as a broadcaster. They called a few Cleveland Browns games that I was locked in on this season, and those were not pretty games, and they made the most of them. I noticed in our comments, like, Jay Feely took a lot of the crap from the people who didn't like this booth. I like the idea of having like a kicking specialist. I think that's a unique angle. And then going back to Ross Tucker, he's very online, which I appreciate. And so I think when you do have somebody online and who's doing local radio hits and who's conversing with you through social media, like, that to me adds to the experience of when they're calling my team's game. So I thought 19, I mean, that was just behind the Simpsons booth. Come on, this is better than the Simpsons altcast.
Hey, you like Mina, though, so.
I do.
All right, Andrew, what you got?
So my underrated one is Kenny Albert and Jonathan Vilma of Fox. They were 16th of 2.07. And we've talked about chemistry a lot, and I think this is a booth that really shows the value of chemistry. They've been working together for a few years now. Vilma was really rough when he started, but I think he's grown significantly as a broadcaster, and I think a lot of his growth has having that continuous pairing with Albert, who is a real pro at this, who he's great at calling the NFL. He's called so many sports and continues to call so many sports, basketball, hockey, etc. And I think he's been exactly the steady hand Vilma needed. And I really like having Vilma as the analyst there, because there's not a lot of defensive guys in these roles. To me, it's a different perspective. It's an underrepresented perspective. And I think that duo has really brought the best out of each other, and Fox has been smart to leave them together and let them grow.
Yeah, I believe Kenny Albert celebrated 500 NFL games this past season. Insane. So definitely deserves some shine, and the Vilma improvement is a helpful factor. But yeah, maybe the lesson of this whole thing is to give these guys time to marinate, and that does go a very long way, even though the constant musical chairs is understandable with these executives trying to take talent and promote people, and agents trying to, vie for whatever seat they might want. But the product for us in our couches, I think, benefits from that time. All right, thank you, Andrew. People can check out the article at awfulannouncing.com. A lot of work went into it. Very good stuff to take away from what everyone across this whole landscape of watching the NFL thinks about all the people who broadcast the NFL. Ben and I will be back to close out the show next. All right, and finally, another round of Stock Watch, Ben, where we break down how the media is basically affecting the news across the world of sports. But I have another bit to throw at you before we get there. And the way I'm going to prove if this one is going to work or not is actually going to be a question, which is, if you can answer to me what week Baltimore Ravens safety Kyle Hamilton moved to playing more of a coverage role in their defense. Can you tell me that?
I can't, no.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you haven't heard it as much as me. This is going to be called the Bobby Bonilla of the week. And what I mean by that is that it is the broken record tidbit of analysis that everybody knows, but loses all meaning or interest because it's thrown out so much. I have heard everybody from Rex Ryan to Dan Le Batard recite this stat this week, and literally everybody in between. It was week 11. So there you go.
It's probably the week after they lost to the Browns.
Probably was. That is a moment of introspection for anybody and everybody that it happens to. But you know what I mean, though? There are sometimes these little bits of analysis that I just, as a sports fan and media consumer, I just know them. But I almost feel like I'm being held hostage and forced to care about it. And it loses the actual importance at a certain point because it's just so overused. It's like, that can't explain everything about the Ravens.
Right. So this is like a more detailed version of like John Harbaugh and Jim Harbaugh are brothers, like just like beaten down storylines.
Yes, it's like the one level deeper of that, where it becomes this kind of crutch for everybody to throw out there. The Bobby Bonilla, we could workshop that name because that's more like a factoid or like trivia, whereas Kyle Hamilton thing is more like, you know, a wannabe Mina Kimes or something.
That's like when I was in high school, Greg Oden was at Ohio State, and the big thing with him was he had broken his wrist, and so he was shooting free throws left-handed. In every game, whether he was still doing it or not, they had to mention that Greg Oden spent half the season shooting his free throws left-handed. So that was like, I feel like that's like the baby version of this, but yeah, the Kyle Hamilton stat is a little more detailed.
I guarantee you on Sunday morning, at least 2 people will say it, and you will think of me, as will the audience.
Well,
Stockwatch. This is the 3rd or 4th time we've done it. We like to basically trace, for instance, how the media ends up firing the Bears head coach, trading the 49ers head coach. A lot of these have been around the NFL coaching carousel, as it tends to generate a lot of intrigue. But Ben, start us off here with an announcer actually impacting this hiring cycle point of the NFL calendar.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm going like full inception here because I am a part of this news cycle, I guess, because I wrote about this at Awful Announcing. But what we're talking about is Tom Brady getting set to call the playoff game between the Detroit Lions and the Washington Commanders. And that's noteworthy because the Las Vegas Raiders, who Tom Brady co-owns, are currently in the middle of a coaching search, and they are reportedly infatuated with Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, who I think is pretty widely considered the top available candidate at this point, with Mike Vrabel off the board in New England. But it's created this thing where I wrote about it, and my line on it was just like, hey, this conflict of interest with Tom Brady that we've been talking about all season, it's on full display here. Like, this is the epitome of what a conflict of interest is, you know. And there's two lines to this, and it's one, from a broadcasting standpoint, is he going to be willing to criticize Ben Johnson and the Lions offense if they falter? Like, how is the Raiders' reported pursuit of Ben Johnson going to affect how Tom Brady calls this game? And then 2, how, like, what does this mean for the Raiders coaching search? Like, is this giving Tom Brady and the Raiders access and insight to Ben Johnson that other teams might not be privy to? And just how do the mechanisms work with that and with the restrictions that have been placed on Tom Brady? And so I didn't really take a stand on it as far as like, is this right or wrong? It was just like, hey, this conflict of interest is coming into full view. But I think what you've had now is kind of a backlash to that. We saw it with Adam Schefter during his appearance on Pat McAfee. Jimmy Traina wrote about it for Sports Illustrated, where their line is like, hey, there's no conflict of interest here. And to me, it's like, well, there can't be no conflict of interest. Like, you can downplay the conflict of interest. You can say, I don't think this is a big deal. I ultimately think this doesn't matter. I think we're making a mountain out of a molehill. But like, whether it's the appearance of a conflict of interest or an actual conflict of interest, to me, it's there. Like, to me, this is a storyline heading into this game that wouldn't otherwise exist if Tom Brady wasn't in these dual roles as the co-owner of the Las Vegas Raiders and the top analyst at Fox.
Well, maybe we can take a stand on if we think it's right or wrong at the end of all of this, but I think you almost can rewind further than that, right? Because there was the whole insider war, so somewhat on the front end of the Black Monday and you know, throughout January off-season cycle here, where Tom Pelissero of NFL Network, most prominently, I think first came out and said, like, Antonio Pierce, Tom Telesco, the guys running the Raiders, like, Brady will have a significant role in determining their futures and ultimately replacing them once they were fired. Diana Rossini went along and basically confirmed that and added a little bit more to it. You had Mike Lombardi come out on the Pat McAfee show. He has basically just become the denier on Twitter of all things North Carolina football and all things Bill Belichick, where Brady was reportedly interested in Belichick potentially as a candidate. Lombardi said that call that might have happened between them was more just, picking Belichick's brain. There's nothing to see here. This is all nonsense. Then you have, as we kind of build out the stock watching of the stock watching here, the game now where that is on full display. But why do you think it is that, whether it's Schefter or I know Stephen A. Smith was very vocal with this and others, that there's just been this insistence that the dual role of ownership and announcing just doesn't matter? Like, why are some people so dead set on convincing us that this is nothing to see here?
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, is it powerful people protecting powerful people? Like, is it they're worried that if we call out Tom Brady's conflicts of interest, that the other conflicts of interest, which are, prevalent throughout the industry, that those are going to suddenly come into focus? I really don't know, because I don't know how you could be a co-owner, and regardless of like how involved you think he is or isn't, he is involved. Like, he's not just like some guy who paid $1 million so that he can get nice seats to the Raiders games every year. Like, he clearly is a co-owner of the Raiders and involved to some degree in their football operations. And so I just think from that perspective, like, how could that not be a conflict of interest? I don't get it.
And like you said, there's also the difference between an actual one and the perception of one. And it almost doesn't matter what the reality is if fans watching at home think it's there, right? And so Tom Brady doesn't buy in to the Raiders to grow his portfolio of investments. Like,
right.
Of course if he's having to sign off on moves or he's around the facility, what are you going to not ask him? You know what I mean? And so about your coach or your quarterback or your whatever. And so the Schefter thing was just crazy, where he's like, tying himself in knots, saying heavily involved. Like, his voice is going. I'm like, what are you talking about? Of course it matters how involved he is and what role he's playing, because this is the part of it that I think maybe we can speak to even more so than the behind the scenes is, for a viewer of the game, it just feels like you're kind of being lied to if it's not addressed, right? Because forget, like the machinations of, does Brady get more access to Ben Johnson and whatever? That's for like, Raiders fans, Lions fans, whatever to care about, I guess. But for me, it's like, I don't want Tom Brady to be kissing Ben Johnson's ass all game and not know why, or just be bothered by it or whatever. Like, as if I'm Fox, or if I'm Kevin Burkhardt for that matter, I want to deliver a good game to people. And if I'm worried that the dude over here is only caring about who's going to replace Antonio Pierce all game and not being honest that play call on third down was not the right one, that just sucks for everybody, even if it's not the biggest possible deal of all this whole thing.
Well, and I think, that's the part of it I'm more interested in than like, what does this mean for the Raiders coaching search? Because I think, you know, stuff happens behind the scenes all the time. I don't think we know like a fraction of how these coaching searches actually work and how people land the jobs that they do. But I think that, the likeliest scenario here is probably the Lions offense looks awesome and Tom Brady doesn't have to face that conflict. But even then, like, it just goes to show how unavoidable these potential conflicts of interest are going to be. Like, what's going to happen when he calls a game that Devontae Adams is in? What's going to happen if, like, let's say Max Crosby demands a trade? What's going to happen when he calls a Max Crosby game? What, like, is he going to be able to call a Raiders game? Like, what, God forbid the Raiders wind up in a prominent position.
Or what if Dion doesn't let Shedeur go to Vegas and then Brady calls whatever team Shedeur's on next year and he's, taking pot shots at him and all this stuff? It's just it's gonna become so blatant at a certain point.
Yeah, and you had some of it when he was calling, because he called a handful of Tampa Bay Buccaneers games, and you had it where, like, it was kind of cute. He got into it with Baker Mayfield or took issue with Baker Mayfield's comments. Like, that's fine. That comes with the territory. But to me, it's like, this is unavoidable. And this like just goes to show why these restrictions have been put in place, why people had an issue with it, why so many people think it isn't sustainable, because to me, the most shocking part was it took this long to get to one of these. Like when you just talk about the idea of an NFL owner calling games in the league, he owns a team. It's unavoidable.
So Richard Deitch at The Athletic had this idea that I think I want to throw at you, which is that Burkhardt and Brady should maybe not start the whole broadcast with it, but address it off the top. And Burkhardt should say, Tom, you have a vested interest in this one, don't you? There's been some rumors going around that you have your eye on somebody on that Detroit sideline. Tell us about it or whatever. And then Brady can just say whatever, disclaimer basically, and keep it moving. Do you think that's realistic that could ever happen? Or is that just like media dreaming?
I think that would be the best way to handle it. Like to me, I think the annoying part is when they treat you like you're stupid. And so you're going to go through this whole broadcast where they're just ignoring the elephant in the room. So I think that's ideal. Do I think that's realistic? Like not a chance in hell. I cannot fathom them because it's even teams barely acknowledge coaching searches as it is. Like we've just now gotten to this point where teams will put out press releases just acknowledging that they interviewed a candidate. You don't get anything more in depth than that. So I don't really know like what Tom Brady could even say to that point, but like, yeah, I think it should be addressed because I ultimately think that's what people have an issue with is I don't think people have an issue with, Tom Brady shielding the Lions and Ben Johnson from criticism as much as they do the reality that we're all going to be treated like we're dumb because they're not even going to acknowledge that this is a real thing. And that's why I find the backlash so baffling because you just like want to pretend like this isn't a conflict of interest. Like if this isn't a conflict of interest, then what is?
Yeah. And the perfect example was Al Michaels, who appeared on a podcast this week and said that anyone who criticizes Brady for this or anything else is just jealous of him. Okay.
Sure.
All right, Al. Okay. Last but not least here, Mike Tomlin and the hot seat that it was or wasn't. And this one I think fits even better for the Stockwatch thing because it was, I think, primarily driven by analysts more so than insiders. So the perception and the opinions being thrown out really started to shape the narrative here where you have, I honestly think it kind of entwines with this pursuit from the media executives of Mike Tomlin. There's that kind of angle that keeps getting thrown out for who knows what reason. That same Al Michaels interview, he's talking about how Tomlin would be great in media because, Pittsburgh is in this stagnant spot as an organization. You have both Jimmy Johnson and Terry Bradshaw on the Sunday show calling for Tomlin to potentially be fired and be traded to the Cowboys. It is just peak content brain from a guy I didn't know could actually have a content brain in Jimmy Johnson. And then even Kirk Herbstreit on the broadcast of the game on Saturday night calling out the staleness and lack of life on the part of the Steelers kind of all contributed to this idea that maybe Tomlin was gone and then therefore gettable by other teams. And then Ben on Monday, the Steelers put the whole thing to bed. He's not going anywhere, and this was all kind of nothing. I mean, this was it just that we needed something to talk about, or do you feel like the Steelers are maybe just, I don't know, a little bit behind the times here, and the analysts are closer to the truth of where this whole thing should look? What do you think?
I think that this is a conversation that's been happening at the local level for a couple of seasons now, just as somebody who is kind of AFC North entwined in this and like follows a lot of Steelers stuff. Like there are a lot of Steelers fans who are ready to move on from Mike Tomlin. It's a little bit like the Ryan Day thing, not necessarily apples to apples because Mike Tomlin has won a Super Bowl and been there for 18 years, I think. But it's like Steelers fans, I think a significant portion of them are ready to move on. And this is just kind of the first season where it's hit the national level. And so when a season ends, there's always this fallout. We saw it when the Vikings lost to the Rams on Monday night. Was like, all right, what's this mean for Sam Darnold? Because of the way the season ends, this is what this means for Sam Darnold. This is what this means for the Vikings offseason, so on and so forth. And I think it's not sexy like to say for the Steelers, hey, they'll just try again next year and they'll probably be 10-7 and get a wild card spot and lose in the first round, which is probably their likeliest outcome. Now it's like, now I think the national conversation has caught up to the local conversation. So I think it's a real conversation, but I also think it ignores that the Steelers are just like the most stable franchise, maybe for better or worse at this point, but like they aren't going to move on, I think personally, until Mike Tomlin wants to, or until they have like a truly disastrous season, which might not ever happen just looking at Mike Tomlin's track record.
The NFL, I think, analysis, sometimes it runs up against that you can't just constantly state the obvious, which is they don't have a good enough quarterback. You can't just say that every time that, you know, the producer points at you. So you got to do something extra. I will say, as somebody who the NFL is not like my top sport to follow and love, I am jealous that these coaches who we know nothing about can generate more intrigue than star players in other sports. The idea of a Mike Tomlin trade can be more exciting to people, even though it's never going to happen. And we don't know anything about Mike Tomlin that would make us genuinely interested in the guy outside of he won a Super Bowl 15 years ago. And yet, you know, here we are, that can be even that can be even interesting enough to an audience to get to a point where this type of narrative can take hold. But that is it for Stock Watch. Let's close out with our hot mic, something that caught our eye, we liked, we disliked throughout the week in sports media. Ben, start us off.
Yeah, I have one that I've had in my pocket now for a couple of weeks, and between the holiday break and other stuff we've had going on, I haven't gotten a chance to get to it. But my hot mic is Danny Goodwin. He's a comedian, I believe, based in Austin, Texas, like every comedian nowadays is. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, he's the guy who's been doing the viral Bill Simmons podcast impressions. They're always Bill Simmons and a regular guest. Danny Goodwin plays them both, talking about some historical event. So it's Bill Simmons and Peter Schrager, I think it was, reacting to 9/11. He's done Pearl Harbor. He's done a handful of other ones I don't want to butcher here. But
yeah, we've gotten Russillo, Chuck Klosterman.
Yeah,
he's going across the whole spectrum.
Yeah, I thought his Klosterman, which I think was his second impression, was his best. That was spot on. His Simmons is really good. It's the voice he doesn't nail necessarily, but he has the mannerisms down. He definitely has all of the verbal tics, which, you know, Bill Simmons aficionados like you and myself definitely appreciate. Everyone that he releases one a week at this point on Twitter and Instagram, probably TikTok too. They're just spot on. They're hilarious between the ad reads and just the typical Simmonsisms and the guests. He's nailed the guests. So Danny Goodwin is my hot mic.
We're seeing a lot of these impressionists, basically what Frank Caliendo was on Fox, but they're all just on social media now, and they're all popping up. I want a meeting of the minds between the impressionist and the impressionee at some point. I want Romo to invite one of these dudes to the booth with him who do a Romo impression. I want Simmons bringing Danny Goodwin on as a guest. I want the genuine. Schrager's a fan of it. He's been tweeting, but other than that, you know, we don't get the reactions from the people at hand. Okay, mine is the Field Pass with Pat McAfee show altcast on ESPN2 for the college football playoff. I want to shout it out because I think it was good, but I wrote about it for the website. I almost felt silly hyping it up so much because why it was good felt so obvious to me, which is that they're at the game. The regular broadcasts are at the game, so I think I would inherently assume that the best way to do another side broadcast would also be to be at the freaking game. And so the fact that they are on the sideline, Pat actually embraces really being sort of a play-by-play setup man rather than just shooting the shit like a lot of these guys want to do, it all contributed to you're feeling the energy. The people are trying to actually deliver you a real sports broadcast with just a little bit of a different tone and tempo to it rather than, just a hangout. It feels like a no-brainer. I'm sure it's more expensive to do. I'm sure that it is intense with the level of production support that already has to be at all these games to have a whole additional, sideshow going on there. But if anyone wants to actually make one of these things work, I feel like this is the way to do it.
Yeah. And that's like, I'm not a big altcast guy. I don't like the Manning cast. Like, I mean, I don't hate the Manning cast, but I just like, I'm not somebody who tunes into the Manning cast every week. Like, I like to watch the games. I don't mean that in like, oh, I focus on sports. I like the games. It's like, I just have enough going on between like my phone and my kids and everything going on. Like, I don't need like two things on the screen also going on, but like from the clips I've seen, like, this is how to use Pat McAfee. Like this, if you want to talk about like what's the best use of Pat McAfee, especially when it comes to college football, it's College Game Day and it's having him on the sideline doing altcasts, like in the environment. Even he called that the Ohio State touchdown, the Jack Sawyer strip sack touchdown, and like was celebrating with Ohio State players in the end zone. Like it was incredible. And so like of all the calls I've seen,
all
like,
while still talking and
right.
and engineering and orchestrating a broadcast so that you felt the touchdown and he didn't just get distracted by the high fives.
Right. And that's like, you have the TV call of the game, you have the radio call of the game. And like, to me, the McAfee one is the one that's going to live on as like,
not to mention the Sark headshot as he just deflates. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think it's a great use of Pat McAfee. I think it really puts like him and his crew and AJ Hawk and all those guys like in a position to succeed. And so that's like, just like what we're a little more than a year into the Pat McAfee experience at ESPN. Like this is the kind of stuff I think they should be leaning into.
Yeah. I mean, I know he does Raw the same night, but like a Monday Night Football or two a year when they have the Super Bowl, could they do it? For that Super Bowl, I believe it is in 2027 that they have the Super Bowl. Like this is working. And I think it works for the same reasons Game Day works. So, This was cool, and it's honestly also like Game Day, one of the only things that Pat does that's exclusive to ESPN. So I would be trying pretty hard to get him to do more of it because I actually own it and I can push people there rather than they can get it on YouTube. So yeah, absolutely. All right, we will be back next week. The football will still be going on. We'll see if any sports can possibly break through here. Check us out at awfulannouncing.com. We're also here for you on the podcast once a week. And we're also on social media, wherever you might be. We are there as well. Instagram, X, TikTok, and beyond. Enjoy all that football, and we'll see you next week.